Welcome to the Sultans of Sales podcast. I'm your host, Jamil Pendleton. My friends call me Jay. Thanks so much for joining for today's episode, which we have a fantastic guest. We have the CEO and co-founder of Proprio, Gabriel Jones, coming at you from Seattle, Washington. Gabe, thanks so much for joining and welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Jay. I'm really excited. Let's dive in.
Yeah, me too. We had a good discussion prior to this recording, and it was really interesting to hear about all the things you all are working on. It's such a fascinating and I would say a pretty big challenge and big idea that you all are trying to tackle. So just for the audience, can you explain what Proprio is, what you guys are trying to do? Obviously, I saw that the CNS Innovation of the Year Award was awarded to the Paradigm surgical navigation platform. And so just that's incredible because that's an honor. And so obviously this is an important technology soon to be released. So can you just kind of walk us through what you guys are up to?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And we were and are very honored by that. You know, that's something that's driven by physicians. And so to be just coming to market and have an understanding, kind of a groundswell of support like that from everyone across neuro and ortho is just such a validating step and feedback for the team that we're really proud of that. And we're not done, right? That's
Sure.
It's just the beginning. So I'd say the same thing is true for navigation, right? And even in the early days of the company, we were really trying to solve for something what we thought was quite different. And the idea was, can you point a bunch of cameras and sensors at the operative field and essentially render all of that in 3D and virtual reality? That was the idea. And it's more of like a loops or a microscope kind of a concept. But in so doing, we realized, okay, you got all these sensors in the field, you're capturing everything, you're reconstructing it in something approaching real time and 3D. And it's really a volumetric sort of a rendering problem when you think about the graphics pipeline associated with it.
Right.
Then we realized we were actually like decoding every element of the operative field. And so that got to be a bigger and more interesting idea, which is inclusive of navigation. Mm-hmm. This is kind of a hint of what's coming in the future. Because essentially you're doing real-time Google Maps on the iPhone for surgery. Okay, cool. Overused analogy, but in this case, I think pretty applicable. Right. Because once you have that real-time map and that real-time feedback, I'm not talking about just real-time rendering, but real-time capture to render pipeline, volumetric imaging in the OR. Okay, that's interesting. What can we layer on top of that? It goes beyond solving the initial pain point that was brought to us by Dr. Brown, my chief medical officer, co-founder and friend, who is, as you're probably aware, a practicing neurosurgeon, pediatric space at Seattle Children's, does both cranial and spine work, and is quite an innovator in his own right. Brought that challenge to us, said, I can't see what I need to see, how I need to see it in the OR. Can you solve that for me? And of course, microscopy, VR microscopy makes sense, but this is a bigger thought. This is, sure. If we knew in a verifiable sense what the actual ground truth was as it changed, as I sought to achieve something in the case. Well, that's a bit of a paradigm shift from here's a snapshot, a moment in time, a 2D slice or a series of 2D slices that are then, sort of registered against. And now everything's changed, but, I certainly don't trust that imagery as much as I would if it was real-time 3D volumetric as the image that I'm creating in my head is, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where it started. And that's why I say navigation is a very key wedge to that.
Sure.
That problem space that we're unlocking, but it's just the first one.
Very interesting. No, it's fascinating. I mean, I think it's where things need to go from my perspective. I mean, we have all these tools and we have these technologies and sometimes they're in their own silos. And so I think what you're describing is at least as far as I understand it, is the ability to scale as surgeons are doing these operations, the ability to apply these technologies together, and then what that could unlock, right, mm-hmm. is truly where I think the innovation is going to happen. But before we dive more into that, not to break this up, but can you just talk about your background a little bit? I noticed you started off in Microsoft Strategic Consulting. You're doing some stuff with the Gates Foundation. It seems just fascinating to see, a lot of these, I would say, younger CEOs coming in with different experience, whether it's sauce or what have you. So can you just give the audience a little bit of background about you before Proprio, and then we'll maybe dive into the early days.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Jay, for calling me a younger CEO. That's very kind of you.
Absolutely.
We'll have to turn up the lights in the room here. I'm 43. I don't know how old you are, but
there you go. Right there, right behind you, 1 year.
Okay, cool, man. Yeah, and you, like me, have had a couple of sort of careers. You've been more focused on sales, but also you're a storyteller, right? So I'd say
Yes,
that's
sir.
a whole skill set in its own right that happens to overlap with sales, but also fundraising, building a company. That's an essential required skill to do something like this. So let me just go back to the beginning, the 90-second version. Started off very entrepreneurial, grew up in an international boarding house, had the tremendous benefit of having people from all over the world live with us, every country you can think of. I grew up around those people and their history and their culture and their language. And that just made me incredibly curious, right? And so I did a couple of degrees concurrently at University of Washington. One of those was Japanese, one was engineering, one was economics. And with that, eclectic combo, I immediately went to Japan and worked in an engineering firm. And what I was trying to understand was, how are things made? And you go back to like 1999, 2000, 2001, and Japan, this is prior to the rise of China, really. In the 90s, Japan was seen as the birthplace of just-in-time manufacturing and Kanban and Kaizen systems and all of that. And the US really learned from the Japanese manufacturing process. So I wanted to understand, is that real? Is that true? And the only way I could really figure that out was to go there to the source. So I went to a Japanese engineering firm. I was the only non-Japanese employee there, which was a trip in its own right. Probably a whole podcast for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the Toyota way.
That's right. But like, how does it actually work, right? Are you able to pull that line, stop the line, and are you hated by your coworkers for slowing things down, or are you revered for focusing on quality and process improvement and continuous improvement? So I needed to know at the source and get some religion about that.
Sure.
So I would say like the next 10 years was really just fundamentally understanding, okay, how do you make things? How do you design and build things at a scalable level? Then I went to DC for 7 years in law and international trade law, IP law. Needed to understand how the hell does this country work? If it does, how does it go? And the joke there is my office was like a couple stories above the White House and Treasury and looked down on them.
Nice.
And I was no hotshot. I was at a white shoe DC law firm, but we had 6 former IRS commissioners as partners in that firm. And why I mention that is just, that is how DC works, right? And that's all I needed to learn.
Right. That's a good experience.
Right. So I was like, okay, got it. Understand how we make things and design them, understand the degree of the law, understand how government works in this country. Now I need to go see how things are paid for in finance. So straight to Wall Street after that. I only needed 2 to 3 years to understand that was fundamental and important.
Yes.
But not the thing that I wanted to work on. So went straight from there to asking that question of like, taking all these pieces, putting them together, can we solve global health issues? Can we do well and do good at the same time? Taking technology, engineering, business mindset, finance, law, putting all that together, and came back to Seattle without a plan, worked with Mohammed Yunus, founder of Grameen Foundation, trying to bring microfinance, microlending, insurance in a nonprofit model to 2 billion of the world's poorest people who live on $2 or less per day. Turns out that's a super difficult scaling problem. And counterintuitively, perhaps, that capitalism is probably a better model to reach scale. So ask Facebook, right? And it's very hard to do those things because incentives really matter.
Yes, they do.
And we all know that really well, but I needed to go learn that. So fast forward, okay, now understand that. Go to the Gates Foundation, go work with Bill Gates. I don't know how I got that job, so I can't reverse engineer that for you, but somehow I'm the guy who's like taking a portable ultrasound and telling Bill Gates, hey, you want me to give you a scan so you can see what the next 10 years of ultrasound looks like in 2014, right? He said, no, thank you. So I had to do it on myself. But
nice.
The reason I bring that up is it brought me to the point of understanding what the horizon of these technologies look like and what successful teams look like. And so that brought me to the point of, okay, now I know I need a brilliant clinician. I need brilliant hardware, software engineers, PhDs, really deep in these areas. And I need to understand, like, what are the most difficult, thorny, long-term problems in medicine today? And that is what led me to the OR and what led to the founding of Proprio.
That's amazing. What a story. And thanks for sharing in such detail, because it gives me, I mean, there's so many different avenues we could take. And so maybe let's talk about your spine surgery, because that's been the chosen. I mean, this sounds like a technology that could be applied to many different ways. And so you chose spine surgery. Why did you do that? And then I guess another question is that, can you talk about technology and innovation in spine, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap in those two answers, right? It's technology in search of a problem to solve is a recipe for disaster. We've seen that happen in medicine quite a bit, right? Plenty of technologists have had cool stuff and thought they'd bring it in. There's a lot of, sort of burned out wrecks of companies along that road. And I think so for us, it was very essential to say, we need a clinician there at every step of the way.
Yes.
It doesn't mean we assume that everything they say is gospel. We need to go check all that math. Partially because the solutions that have been brought to them in the past are not complete. And that's a really key point I think we'll come back to in this conversation. So we started diving in. We knew we had a magical demo, where you could look around corners and you can imagine how this would be impactful. We got asked to do things like shoot music videos. I'm not kidding, for Beyonce. Put this thing on a Mars rover. I'm not kidding. So I went to the NASA Jet Propulsion Labs, and they were trying to figure out how do we mount a robotic arm with cameras on the current version and the future iterations of the Mars rover. And it turns out you can't get much data off of Mars. It's really hard.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So Beyonce and Mars in the same.
I know, right? It was unplanned for sure. But you're onto something if Beyonce and Mars come up in the same 2-week period.
That's right.
And so I think a key in the early days when you're developing something deep tech like that is explore those things, but give yourself a pull the cord kind of moment. If the market's not there, if the need isn't there, if the hint of adoption and product market fit is not there, you got to be able to make that call soon and be really honest with yourself. And I'll tell you, it's very hard with deep tech, because once you get something like that working, everybody just goes, when do I get this? How can I get it? How can you get it to me? And so the process was, we looked at all of medicine and we said, okay, is this a telemedicine product? Okay, is it really that helpful to have volumetric imaging for telemedicine? Maybe not today. And we took all those technical challenges, product opportunities and market opportunities, and we mapped all that. And then we came back to it and said, where are the opportunities where imaging both hard tissue and soft tissue in real time, volumetrically, would have the greatest impact? So one of your other questions about the history of innovation in spine, we can go back to 1890s or whatever, battlefield X-rays and World War I, and we're all familiar with those stories. But the last really meaningful thing happened in 1996, right? And that was part of the sophomore Danek acquisition of surgical navigation technologies. We all know the story. Even myself, not having been in spine for that long, I know that lineage, right?
Sure.
And I just hired the guy who took that technology to Medtronic, Tommy Carls, who led R&D for Medtronic for many years.
Yes.
And I'll explain part of the reason why I think Tommy joined the team in a minute. But, that was great. It was stereotactic navigation. And it worked pretty well in that context. Well, that was 1999 when that FDA clearance came through, right?
Yes. We're
on S8, S9 is reported to be sort of on the way or whatever. It's a 7-year product cycle. And, unfortunately, most of the industry has been tethered to that approach for that entire period. That was 25 years ago, my friend, So I think it's great. We should just acknowledge that. We don't have to look down on that.
Sure. Yeah. No. Yeah.
From there to here, and now we say, okay. Part of our evaluation was, could you launch something that was a full step change, not incremental? That
step change. Yep.
Meaning
okay,
this here, there's incremental, and there's what if this is possible? Someday it wasn't possible. Monday it's possible. How does that change everything you think about and do, and new things that are built? Is that possible? Oh, and by the way, you have to fit that into the workflows of today, however flawed they might be.
There you go. Workflows.
You end up throwing more out of the boat to earn the right to be in that conversation. And I think that's an essential and to a degree humbling experience, right? To say Beyonce and Mars, let's come down to, can we navigate a pedicle screw?
Right.
And can we do it quickly and accurately and with a high degree of trust? And then once you get there, you go, okay. And you take those increments and you add them up, and then you turn around and go, okay, that was yesterday. And now today, you're going to be able to do things in real time, volumetrically with feedback, intraoperative guidance that's going to change the way that you even think about an approach to something. Preoperative planning looks very different in that scenario because you have so much longitudinal understanding of what the likely outcome of the case is, that you're likely to change, what you might attempt to do in that case, because now you can say, okay, what I do in my last 500, and you can aggregate that information in such a way that's easy to consume.
That seems to be a very popular, crowded space, right? The machine learning, like getting all the information together to make these, to improve outcomes, to improve or enhance workflows. Can you talk about that? Like what's happening today? What are you seeing? Like, and just in general, like, because I think what you're describing is really big innovation if we can do it, if it can be pulled off.
Yeah, I think there's a boil the ocean approach, which is guaranteed to not work. And there's too incremental of an approach, which is probably not going to make a difference for a very long time. And you're looking for a number of steps you can take along that path, right? And so Tony Fadell from Apple, and this may have been a Steve Jobsism that he adopted. I don't know the source of it, but it's attributed to Tony. And Tony is indirectly an investor in our company through one of the funds. And so I've had the opportunity to talk to him a couple of times. Great in that he was part of the early pre-iPhone development approaches to PDAs and things that failed, which those were lessons that then were applied. And he said, constraint to your friends, right? And so from a machine learning, neural networks, reinforcement learning perspective, putting parameters around a problem is actually essential for success. And so is data engineering. So the companies you hear talking in those terms that are able to be facile and going in to talk about, sagittal alignment and things like that in depth, experts on that topic, which every great salesperson that and every great rep is an expert, right?
I would agree.
They put in that work and they're facile. We need reps and people in those conversations who also understand computer vision, also understand data collection, data engineering, processing, and what's possible. And I'd say that and clinicians who understand what's possible and what's not with those kind of approaches is a big gap right now. And so it's our job to go out and help people be able to speak both languages, to be able to understand what is bullshit, frankly.
Sure.
What is less likely to succeed. And I'll give you an example.
Yeah, please.
UCSF is doing some of the best work out there in using AI tools to evaluate existing data sets.
Right.
Key point is the existing data sets are not engineered. They weren't captured for this purpose. So I would listen to people who say, we're designing things that capture a data set and prepare it for the use of these tools. That's different than saying, we're gonna go capture all these preoperative scans and try to apply AI tools that weren't designed for that to an existing data set. That's suboptimal from a processing standpoint, and the likelihood of a tool under the AI umbrella being able to deliver something world earth shattering is unlikely unless you're able to marry those two things together. So UCSF is doing super interesting stuff with looking at their own data sets to say, if we retrospectively went back and looked at 10 years of data, what was the biggest driver of a positive clinical outcome and patient reported outcome, right? Somewhat different things, important distinction.
Yes, sir.
You know what the biggest driver of that is? I know you know because we already talked about
We talked about it, but I didn't. It was not something that I thought of first. I mean, it makes sense, but go ahead.
Patient selection. Patient selection. Right? It's like 85% of the driver of the clinical and patient reported outcome, which is fantastic. And it's very important seminal work in the space. And Tom Peterson and Dr. Chris Ames.
Absolutely.
Have done great work there. And I think Google has been involved in that. And UCSF, who better than UCSF in the Bay Area to be able to do that work? Well, first of all, we should be doing that at all top academic centers, those kinds of things. And second, patient selection isn't the way to ultimately to deliver exceptional world-class care at scale to anybody, irrespective of their, socioeconomic condition at that particular moment or what they're born into. So that's the most advanced stuff I'm aware of in the space. And I may not be aware of everything, but I'm reading all the white papers and going to those conferences, and I'm pretty obsessed with this problem. Mm-hmm. So I would bet I'm like somewhat aware, and that's it. So that's cool, but that's not nearly enough.
Right.
And we need to tackle the kinds of problems that, for example, where incrementally in the case, you have something approaching a guarantee of hitting a performance goal in that like sub game of the surgery. And if you can put constraints around that and apply preoperative, intraoperative imaging, real-time updates to that, you're much more likely to be able to achieve that. And by the way, machine learning type tools are much better at those kind of constrained problems. And if
you're saying that's where they shine, that's where they shine, is in that moment.
And if you engineer the capture, processing, engineering of those data engineering is really a field now, which is awesome. Then you have the algorithm engineers working on that problem that has been set up for success and constrained for success. Well, I'm more likely to believe a team that's making claims like that. I just don't see very many of them, and that's super biased, right? Because that's exactly what we're doing.
But it's a real problem. And we talked about this, off mic. It's like the CFOs of hospitals are making decisions today without really any relevant data or data that doesn't really bring them the information to make those decisions, if that makes sense. So
I think one of the best questions being asked right now to those people and to payers for that matter is, what do you wish you knew? And usually it leads to an OR utilization number or something like that. And my follow-up, the user experience, designer in me goes, okay, let's go a little further than that. Imagine I could give you all of that. But tell me more. Like, what would you really like to know before it happens? And I think that leads to some very interesting conversations with payers and providers.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly next level. What we talked about earlier about where this technology could take things in terms of healthcare, right? The just improving it, democratization of it, and all that. What about, we talked about data a little bit, and one of the things I was interested in is kind of your thoughts on the current narrative, right? So we know it's going to play a role. It already is here in terms of some of the workflows and efficiencies and just the ecosystem in that operating room where data is playing a big, big role, right? All the big strategics are focused on it. But you mentioned something to me that I made a note of and put this in the question, like something scares you about this current narrative.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate? Because I was pretty fascinated by that.
Yeah, and on two fronts, it's really frightening, right? Not surprising, but frightening. If you listen to the big players right now, I'm happy to name names, Medtronic, J&J, et cetera. What they're most excited about is what I would call balkanization and siloization of data, right? And, going and capturing a whole bunch of data and building bespoke data pipelines, and a data estate, if you will, to use more of a tech terminology, that is only accessible within, those sort of walled gardens, is what's happening right now. And they're very excited about, because that gives them the opportunity to go sell in the same way you would drop a Mazor robot and say, it's gonna, occupy territory in the OR, help us sell implants. It's the same way of thinking. And I'm not saying it's bad from a business standpoint, but does it really accelerate our ability to open up the market to faster, of course, safe and regulated, but faster iteration on these technologies? I would argue we have plenty of data to say that it does quite the opposite, right? Why is a robot in our space, at least in spine initially, is a glorified drill guide? Why is that, right? Because it's been optimized to do one thing, which is to deliver the implant. And to do that, you need to cannulate, and you need the thing that you can go deliver that screw in that case. And I know we're early days, but we're not in early days of robotics.
No, not at all.
Early days of surgical robotics, right? So like there's models that have been proven out there that are super effective from a business standpoint, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about economics. We shouldn't be afraid of that. Doesn't mean we're bad people if we're trying to build a business. That's okay.
Sure.
But we can have twin goals of clinical outcomes, delivering on that front, frankly, making surgeons' lives easier instead of harder, and delivering, on the economic side. So that's what makes me really frightened is also as a consumer of healthcare or someone who has a 78-year-old mother who will need surgery. And just like you, we have loved ones that are going to need care, and it's not going to be something they can access as seamlessly and when they need it. Right? And that scares me because when the data gets siloized, like, other products, and you put the surgical synergies kind of approach to it, the likelihood that we get cutting edge emergent technologies delivered in our space, which is what we really need, goes way down in that scenario.
And can I ask why? Is it because you're limited? Is it like groupthink, or is it just because you got that one siloized data point or group of engineers that are only focused on their implants? Is that why we're not getting the innovation? There's
so many analogies to this. Once you get this, you'll be like, oh shit, I see this has been happening in our economy for a very long time. So like, let's just talk about like any of the crashes we've had in our economy. It's when a whole bunch of people spent a lot of time focused on the wrong things, right? So whether that was 1929, 30, et cetera, the run up to that, or 2000, right? People were trying to securitize things that they didn't truly understand. And they were innovating in securitization of real estate, right? In 2007 to 2009,
right?
In the tech bubble in 1999, 2001, we had people going into technology spaces and claiming to have technology companies that could be real businesses, but they didn't know how to do that. But they had all this financial support. And so you had, pets.com or whatever that crashed, right? Because it never had a path to business. And so you have people who are really smart, but they're working in a domain that they don't either understand, or they're working on the wrong things. The outcomes are bad. We already know this.
Sure. Absolutely.
So fast forward 2007, 2009, that was the real estate crisis. And I would argue that, the last several years, we've had a lot of businesses that have been financially supported by VCs and private equity and other modes of funding that really shouldn't have been businesses. Right? They're not engineered for profitability or sustainability long term. And I think that's the kind of thing, if you could wrap your head around that, you're like, okay, if we're focused on trying to lock people out, then we're working really hard on a lockout. And we got a bunch of smart people that are going to be working on lockout. Instead, if we had a bunch of smart people and they were working on democratization of a platform that makes money and has clinical impacts that are measurable as well, well, wouldn't that be awesome?
The twin goals. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's very hard for humans to have two competing thoughts in their head at once, and it hurts your head a little bit. But that is literally the effect of widening the neural pathways and neuroplasticity. That's why when you try to speak a language after not doing it for a long time, you go, shit, I got dumb.
Right.
That's not what happened. Your brain actually hardened. And so you can actually reverse engineer this neuroplasticity thing by saying, we're going to come about it a different way, which is part of the conversation I really enjoyed previously, was the product is determined by what the organization looks like.
Yes. Let's dive into that. Let's talk about that organizational design. That was fascinating. As a psychology minor, I was digging it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Medtronic, Stryker, those guys are really good at what they do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Stryker, on the calls, they're always, the analysts always give them a lot of props for being great capital allocators, which is awesome. I would say Stryker, let's just use that as an example, is good at two things, actually. They're optimized for capital allocation and Salesforce, right? And what makes an acquisition like Mako so rare for them, which I would say is probably a grand slam for them, with the numbers, and the fact that their market share on knee surgeries is growing, and the percentage of those, the proportion that is driven by Mako, is also growing at the same or a faster rate, right?
Right.
So it shows that they're taking territory, and that Mako is actually taking Stryker's territory, in a sense, its own territory, in a good way for them.
Absolutely.
But that's a rare acquisition. for a firm that is focused. We're the size of an acquisition at 1.7 billion, right? And a lot of people snickered when that price tag came out. I don't think they're laughing that hard right now, right? So excellent capital allocators that then applied their other superpower, which is a great sales force, to that capital allocation. And that, I would say that's probably viewed as a success because they looked, I don't know if they did this with self-awareness, they took the things that they're good at as an organization and married them together and made a big bet. I think that's a good way to think about it is,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, if we as Proprio wanted to go fit into the workflow and be an incrementally better navigation system with an implant and do this and that, and like that path is known, and we can go fight that battle with all the other people that are trying to do the same thing. And I think if you design the organization with disruptors who stretch your brain and give you headaches in a good way,
right?
Question. We just added David Mintz from Oris to the team, which I'm very excited.
That's awesome.
David is freaking relentless, and that's what I love about him. He'll be here tomorrow. And you just put enough of those people constantly searching for those people who make you uncomfortable around the table, and they will push you to think differently, or as Steve Jobs said, think different. And I think it's a very intentional thing. We don't always succeed at it. It's always very nice to be surrounded by people who agree with you. And I think from the founder CEO perspective, that's what I try to do, is just bring in people who are going to push me and us and ask lots of tough questions. And smart, innovative surgeons are part of that sort of group. So if you look at our medical advisors, they are people who push us quite a bit.
For sure.
It goes throughout the organization, though. If you really want to buy into it, it's a cultural pillar. It's in your documents. It's in the way you talk. It's in the people you bring in, the people you don't bring in.
Yeah, I mean, you're structuring your company based on, in my perspective, what you're structuring the company to deliver the product, not the other way around. Like, or no, I'm sorry. So the organization, we talked about the data, to deliver truly on data that it has to be, as you said, just permeating throughout your culture. And that's kind of how that's how you're building this company, right? Is that fair to say?
Down to the hiring, of course, and who we asked to join the team. Onboarding, absolutely, right? Every little step, if you're engineering it just like you were saying, okay, let's take a look at that circuit board. Humans are not robots, so there's all kinds of variation. But let's be honest, software and hardware and complex systems, are somewhat predictable, but how humans are going to use them and how they're going to perform and go off label and do all sorts of things, the only thing predictable about that is it will happen. Right. So it's better to say, let's try to engineer for that unknown.
Sure.
And let's pay attention and iterate and not be afraid of, the organization and the culture going in a direction that is not the one that I wrote down on a piece of paper 5 years ago. Great. That's called ownership. And that's another cultural pillar. Yeah.
You got to be able to pivot. I mean, when you see it as it's happening, and that it's not always comfortable.
Yes. So I'll play it back to you. Like, you've got deep sales experience, have won all the awards, damn near all of them, right? I'm sure you've got a shelf in the room behind you. It's blurred out, but with like
some stuff.
Well earned, right? Diamond, this and that, and the other thing. And I don't say that lightly, because that is a science and an art form in itself that I deeply respect. But like, I wonder if you've ever had an organization say to you, and Jay, this may sound like I'm recruiting you, not yet. But like, what would that be like if you were really that close to a product innovation process that was so responsive and so innovative and so ready to explore your ideas as the tip of the spear, who knows the surgery better than even you've seen more surgeries than most of the surgeons you work with, right? What an asset, what a resource if you can figure out how to tap into that. It's part of the reason why I say, with tremendous respect for the rep.
Yeah, I think it would be invigorating. I mean, I think a lot of the sales reps, at least from my perspective, like, the products are built, it's commercialized, and we're here to be, the messenger, to create the relationship, to poke the bear, make it hurt, find the pain points, find ways to solve problems for our surgeon customers. And then medical sales is an interesting space because it's sales on the front end, but then once you get that sale, it shifts into much more of a service, and just you're part of that team with the surgeon, that ecosystem of that specific patient on the table. And it's a very humbling and challenging, but ultimately fulfilling role. And that's why I think a lot of people are just lifers in it, because it's addictive. It's really amazing to be part of that team. So the sales part is just kind of part of it. And I appreciate the kind words earlier. I mean, what you're describing, and I think it's just being on the forefront of something. It's an interesting model because with salespeople, as far as I understand, like they're brought in at different stages of organizations, right? Dependent on kind of what those needs. And so, to being able to have input, I think is based on that knowledge would be fantastic.
I'll give you a thought exercise. Like everybody, the most common assessment I hear of entrepreneurs is that they are less risk averse or go towards risk more than the average person who doesn't, start companies and try to build things. And I challenge that because my view of it is I kind of map the world, and I bring my own bias to that, of course. And I go to subject matter experts and I ask them all these questions. And part of that is part of that journey, the result of that journey that I described to you earlier, getting the opportunity to work with so many subject matter experts in so many fields taught me to find them and then question the hell out of them. And so you do that and you end up with this map of the world as it is right now. And then you think in what I call first, thirds, and fifths, right? So it's the first step that an entrant to a space would lead with, right? Here's my wedge. Second is, of course, the response from the incumbents. Thirds is, okay, I want to be one step ahead of that. But the best of the best are 2 steps ahead. You're at 5. You're at step 5. It's at least locked and loaded, ready to go, or you're working on it already before you take step number 1. That's the ideal approach.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
So what we call 135, first, thirds, and fifths. So when you've mapped and gridded out everything in the market, you have a competitive landscape, and you say, where is everybody going? You're inherently wrong about that, so you got to stay ahead of them. But when you do that, everybody's going in various directions, and there's this coalescing around the same approach. And that's in spine, that'd be implants, nav if you can get it, imaging if you can get it, and a great sales force is table stakes. But when you map that world, whether you're 80% right or not, that's the difference between success and failure. There's inherently a white space somewhere out there, and hopefully you're right about that. Right. That's actually the least risky spot in the entire market as far as I'm concerned, because everybody else is everywhere else and it's a blood path. So
you're in the white space, you're just trying to figure it out.
So that plus if you're at Microsoft for 20 years or whatever, just saying like an example of what is often conveyed as the absence of risk, right? I'd say 1, large companies do layoffs all the time, so that's risky in its own right. 2, your under inherent risk is you're never going to find out what you were capable of. That's super risky.
Yes, it is.
You going out on your own, doing this podcast and all that, that's a risk. But it's also a risk of what if I never did that and unlocked that psychology major in me and really applied it? That sounds risky as hell to me. So that's 1. 2, I'd say in any place like a care continuum, think about the whole thing. Right? And the OR is one spot on that care continuum. There's all these massively valuable opportunities with information and data, another way to put that. And these sources of information, you got to evaluate the quality of the source, but they're often overlooked. These are people in our society who get ignored for various reasons, from sexism to racism to classism to you name it. And I look at across any continuum of information like that, I look for the opportunities where, and we do, where things are overlooked or assumptions are heavy, is rife with assumption. And I'll give you an example. In spine, our first landing place, there's this assumption that there's only like 1 or 2 ways to sell things. That sounds like an opportunity to me. And when I talk to reps, they are often hustling, they're working really hard, they're downtrodden. Their company is often putting pressure on them regarding the price of things, and The facility is like, get out of my way, because they're seen as, often, there are exceptions, of course, but you've lived it. There are often times when people see you as, being a, necessary evil, or in the way, or what are you doing in my or my, you've had, I'm sure you've heard all of that.
Oh, yes.
But that to us looks like an opportunity. That's a person who has all kinds of interesting information locked away. Maybe they asked about a new product idea. It's focused on a new implant line, to launch a new implant line to attract attention from physicians to try to gain some territory, which makes sense. Mm-hmm. But we look at the holistic experience as an opportunity. So what can you tell me about how selling to the hospital could be easier and faster in non-obvious ways? Well, you could tell me, what are the pain points that made that director of finance that kicked you out of the OR or whatever pissed off in the first place?
Yeah.
It wasn't you. It was that inventory and billing sucks or something. I'm just making
Sure. Yeah. It's the tribal knowledge of each situation. Yeah.
Who's better than you to identify that pain point? And that's the thread I want to tug on and say, okay, how does the product go there? Mm-hmm. How does the platform solve that problem? And I can't talk much more about that, but just thinking deeply like that. Like, I think there's a lot of folks like reps who are, and physicians in a way, who are, the circulating nurse, largely ignored in this process of saying, what's a holistic solution look like? Let's just think in those terms. And I think there's a lot of gold mines to be unearthed there. I
would agree with you completely. I mean, that's exciting, Gabe. And, I'm excited to see where you and the team take Proprio. And before we close out, can you talk about the name? Because we talked about that at the beginning, and just for people, like it's an interesting backstory.
Yeah. First, to file the paperwork when we started the company, we let Dr. Browd name the company because we knew we'd change it at some point.
Right.
And remember, the original idea was, hey, can you replace my scope? But he was also thinking about loops. Can we just wear an AR, VR headset instead of loops? And I give him a hard time about this all the time. So he named the company, just in the paperwork, E-Loops.
E-Loops.
Because he had iPhone on his mind and whatnot. And I always give him crap about that because he's good at so many things. But branding is a different thing. And, you don't want to be named after something that you're replacing. You don't want to be named after something that is maybe not beloved or not associated with a bigger idea or concept. You want to be associated with ability. You want to be associated with seeing around corners, having an impact. And I think that's part of the reason why we came to the conclusion that it should be something like a capability that we are enhancing. Right. And so for physicians, their proprioception, their ability to build digital models in here, using their cameras, their eyes, and the haptic feedback that they get from the world is proprioception. And their fine motor skills, irrespective of what type of surgeon they are, from orthopedics to microsurgery and everywhere in between, is a cornerstone of what they believe their value they're bringing to that surgery is.
Love it.
Whether you're doing T-lifts all day or you're doing vascular surgery, whether you're clipping a basilar aneurysm, right? Everything in between. And so when we looked at it and said, it's not E-Loops, it's about enhancing what surgeons can do. It's beyond super surgeons and superpowers. It's what if you could guarantee that your feedback from the real world was accurate? And that's why we got to proprioception, and every doctor knows that word, and they associate us then with their abilities. And I think that's where you want to be as a brand.
Well played. No, I think it's great. Well, any final, I've taken up so much of your time. I know it's valuable and scarce these days. Is there anything that you'd like to share with the audience, or anything you'd like to, kind of close out with?
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate that. We're hiring and we love working with innovators at every level and direction of the organization. We have an unusual approach to talent and to empowerment. And I think that goes throughout the org, but also goes to our clinical partners. We work with the best. And that doesn't just mean surgeons who are 20 years into their practice, who are known names. That means we want the young folks who grew up gamers, digital natives, an Xbox controller feels really comfortable in their hands, who play VR games or, with their kids or whatever. Everywhere in between. We like folks who question and push, as you and I discussed on this podcast and this interview. It's been really fun, by the way. So if anybody would like to reach out, whether it's on social, we're easy to find. Proprio on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and we try to share some of our thinking and articles that we see out there and sort of the directions we see medicine going. And if you want to come help us push that envelope, we welcome you to the team.
Love it. Yeah. I think you guys do a great job on social and just kind of promoting everything, your vision, your company, and your brand. So kudos to you and the team for that.
Thanks, Jay.
You bet. Well, thanks so much for spending some time with us. It's been a fascinating discussion. Wish you guys all the best, and really, really excited to see, where things go for Proprio and for you and Jess and the team. So thanks so much for joining. Thank you to the audience for tuning in this week. And we'll be back with another episode of the Sultans of Sales podcast. Thank you so much. Yeah, hang on one sec.